Hey everyone, it's Mo Kabbara here, President of Transition Accelerator. We're going to be getting started shortly. We've got just a few people still trickling in, start in a couple minutes. Thank you for joining us. And I see there's already enthusiasm from the crowd asking questions. So very excited about diving into this with Bentley today. So yeah, it'll just be a couple more minutes. And while we kind of just wait for folks to join in, I'll just flag, you know, just by acknowledging, first, I would like to acknowledge, the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples on which we work and live. Transition Accelerator, we're an organization that has staff all the way from Victoria to Halifax, and we recognize and respect the ongoing relationships, Indigenous peoples, and we commit to the process and ongoing process of reconciliation. I also want to flag that we recently released this white paper on building the future economy that Bentley and I are going to be kind of using as a little bit of the framework for the conversation today through some of the questions that were sent through this Ask Me Anything webinar. And also that we have a lot of great work coming forward, this fall, including a launch of a specialized web tool that will help kind of explore the actions that different provinces can take to transform and grow their electricity grids. We have a national building decarbonization forum happening in Ottawa between November 26th and 27th. And then also a lot of engaging conversations in our webinar series. So stay tuned for that. So with that, I'm just going to get started, given that it's 1:05, and to thank everybody for joining us on time. So I'm joined here today by our VP of Future Economy, Bentley Allan, who's also a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. And Bentley, maybe you can just start by saying hi to folks, kind of quick introduction in terms of who you are, maybe some people kind of just giving them a little bit of an intro of some of the work you've done on industrial policy before we kind of get started on the questions that we received.
Yeah, hi everybody. It's great to be with you today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I'm a professor and work very closely with the Transition Accelerator here. In my professorial work, I do work on geopolitics and the international order, the history of the international order. And I also run the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab at Johns Hopkins University. And we do work. We just released a new study of outbound Chinese FDI, where we collected original data. I've published on comparative industrial policy design and what makes green industrial policies in countries interesting and what causes them. Why do countries use different approaches in different contexts? And I try to bring this knowledge to Canada through the Transition Accelerator, where I've been working very closely with Mo and the team here for almost 5 years now. Really trying to advance the conversation and really shape policy here on what we need for the industrial strategy here in Canada. Really delighted to have this conversation and excited to see so many familiar faces and names in the participant list.
Awesome. So thanks, Bentley. So I'm just going to get us started here, and I'll post in the chat just in a minute here, sort of the structure of sort of the narrative arc of the webinar as I kind of see it. But feel free to kind of just put in your questions throughout the process, and I'll just be keeping an eye on them and be pulling questions, at the appropriate time in terms of the topic or that we're on. But I want to kind of just start here with the broader context. Bentley, we wrote this paper on building the future economy, and one of the things really that's at the start of it, talking about sort of Trump's tariffs and exposing kind of Canada's dangerous dependency, 77% of exports to the US. You argue in the paper, this is one of the questions we also received, about this new approach to industrial strategy or policy. And I guess if you want to kind of double click on that in terms of what makes this a different approach, as it relates to also some of the failed attempts that we have, in terms of like the conversation often gets, focused on picking winners and losers and not wanting to pick winners, but it's a much bigger conversation than just that, as you kind of make the argument in the paper. So wanted to kind of open the floor here just to kind of start with this, broader context geopolitically, but also the approach or the new approach of industrial strategy as described in the paper?
Yeah, thanks. One of the things that strikes me is when you study the history of industrial policy in Canada, you run up against the same themes over and over again. So one of the things that I like to quote is from a book by a guy named Richard French. And I see David Wolf on the call today. He's the true dean of Canadian industrial strategy, as far as I consider it. And David recommended this book to me, and one of the quotes from the book is that, if we look at Canada's industrial policy, we can see that there are a lot of industrial policies, which is to say there are a lot of attempts to bolster specific sectors in the context of the Canadian economy. But what we have yet to see is a coherent industrial strategy, a set of interlinked measures that work across the economy and across the country geographically to actually strategically align an industry with overall geopolitical imperatives of the country. And I think we're in this really serious moment. Trump has challenged the basic foundations of how we have evaluated our sovereignty and our economy. And we have an opportunity, and I think this government, the thing that I find most exciting about the current government, about Prime Minister Carney and his ministry, is the idea that we are actually going to get serious this time, that we are actually going to take control of our sovereignty and to do so through an industrial strategy, right? But at the same time, industrial strategy can't mean business as usual. It can't mean just a series of disconnected industrial policies that operate in individual sectors, but that don't add up to more than the sum of their parts. So for me, the core to our approach that we're arguing for is to create an industrial strategy that does in fact add up to more than the sum of its parts, where all of the sectors are integrated, and that they each articulate an individual vision for that sector. How is it that Canada is going to be competitive in a global future economy? And then backcasting and working back to the things that we need to do today in order to do that. So in very broad strokes, what we're advocating for here is really a coherent approach to bolstering the Canadian economy that aligns a number of sectors with a future orientation and a geopolitical focus.
Yeah. And just to double click on that in terms of the sectors connecting, one of the questions that we got, which is, we talk about all these different sectors in the paper, automotive, steel, aluminum, critical minerals, mass timber. We even kind of reference agriculture, medical, AI, like those other sectors that are not necessarily in the energy space, but still part
Yeah.
of that future economy. Like, how do these connect rather than compete was one of the questions that we got, given that there's a lot of competition in terms of what they're going after, right? In terms of whether it's input materials or energy or all of that, right?
Yeah, I think that first of all, they connect because they are all building on a common base, right? Which we call in the paper, and which we'll talk more about today, what we call the upstream industrial base, which is to say a set of technologies and categories like clean power, advanced manufacturing capabilities, labor, R&D capacity, infrastructure, trade corridors, these things that make it possible for all industries to succeed, right? So they're all connected by this industrial base. But the other thing is that each of the individual sectors that we would look at here, whether it's automotive or steel and aluminum or critical minerals, they all have to be positioned in a kind of similar way, which is to say we have to have a very clear thesis about how it is that we're positioning Canada's strengths within an international global competitive context, right? And in many cases, we don't get that specific in the way that we articulate it, right? So even in the critical mineral strategy, for example, where we are identifying specific metals, we could be deeper in terms of how we're articulating the value of or the potential value of Canada to the global markets here, both in terms of targets, but also in terms of which technologies are we going to be building in the midstream? How are we actually going to process those materials and build integrated value chains? In steel and aluminum, I think we've lost sight of exactly how we're going to modernize steel and aluminum for both an energy transition future, but also in a globally competitive landscape, right? I think that there's a deep and serious conversation for how we're using technology. And remember, steelmaking is 150 years old at this point. We're talking about a
Yeah.
very old process that needs to be truly modernized. And it's not clear where the innovation is actually going to come from in order to generate a long-term competitiveness industry within steel. So actually looking forward to the technology trends and how they're going to shape this sector, and then bringing those technology trends into a strategy for the present. We often just aren't getting there. In many cases, our support, say for steel and aluminum, ends up being in reactive mode. Well, we have a political problem now. We need to support the workers and the firms in these sectors because they are suffering under Trump's tariffs. But we don't necessarily have a clear national vision for what it was that we're trying to do with that sector. So when it comes time to respond, as the government is currently doing, they basically say, we're going to put $1 billion on the table and we're going to help you, right? But that sort of seems to put the cart before the horse, right? Articulating that you're going to provide support before actually articulating what the strategy that is going to guide the deployment of that support just has things the wrong way around. And it basically is putting up a sign that says, come and lobby us for this money, rather than saying, here are the kinds of things that we're looking for when we are going to lay this money on the table. So a sectoral vision is critical, but then the sectors have to be tied together. And I do think this government really gets that. It's been talking a lot, for example, about how we maximize steel and aluminum content in our automotive industry. The one clear, articulated, coherent industrial strategy that has been on the books in Canada since 2019, since Mo himself worked at ISED, is the mines to mobility strategy, which is to say that there are critical minerals that are going to flow through a midstream into a Canadian automotive industry. And that's a way of integrating the sectors, right? About talking about how critical minerals can be situated within the automotive sector. And those kinds of integrations where we look across the sectors, see how they're related, and advance common initiatives that bolster one or more than one of these individual technology options. Yeah, that's kind of critical to what we're doing and to our vision of industrial strategy.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you mentioned, Bentley, now that I think would be interesting to explore a bit, there's like it's not like this is new, like this is kind of creating new problems for these sectors. Like there's
Right.
a lot of these things are kind of sort of flaring up. But if you look at the auto sector, for example, like we were number five, we were in the top five like 20, 25 years ago in terms of how many vehicles we produce globally, right? And then that number kept going down in terms of ranking, and we like ended up in like 13, 14, 15, right? So it's like been a decline and a challenge to the auto sector. But like you were saying, some of these other sectors too, including steel, aluminum. Um, but I think it's sort of flaring up, like there's these flare ups that kind of force you to really think about this in a way that otherwise you could kind of not necessarily ignore, but just continue to just do business as usual, right? And I think maybe this is the disruption that is bringing this opportunity for us in terms of like we have to face this now, we have to do something different because
Right.
it's sort of sink or swim in a way, right?
Yeah, and it always, in looking at industrial strategy transnationally, like looking at it in other countries, it always
Yeah.
does take a moment like this for a country to really become serious about its industrial
Mm.
strategy. So I like to say and teach and write that the best industrial strategies follow geopolitical shocks. And just to give you an example of that, in the 1970s, Korea was about 10 years into its industrial strategy. It had already taken steps to try to transform what was fundamentally a poor agricultural economy into a modern technological superpower. And the vision that they had in their head was Japan was doing extremely well, and they were going to index themselves to Japan. Of course, Japan at that time was indexing themselves to the United States, just directly trying to come at the highest value sectors where the US dominated global production, like electronics and steelmaking and things like that, and automotive. Of course, Honda and Toyota, major products of that. And Korea was just benchmarking themselves to Japan. And then in 1971, there's what we now call the Nixon shock, in which basically Nixon threatened to basically abandon South Korea. You have to remember that South Korea was created as an entity after the Korean War. And so being
Yeah.
protected from North Korea and from China was a geopolitical necessity. And Nixon was now saying, well, we're maybe not going to provide the level of defense commitment to South Korea that we thought we once were. So this should sound very familiar. This is the same shock that the Canadians and the Europeans are now processing, right? And in response, what Korea did was basically say, you know what, we need to be able to look after our own military, we need to be sovereign, and we need to be an economically indispensable superpower. And so how are we going to do that as a country? They invested very strongly in their upstream industrial base, in minerals processing, in steel and aluminum, in heavy industry and chemicals. And so the heavy chemical and industrial drive turned Korea and really generated all of the major firms that we now think of when we think of Korea. So we have an LG factory planned in Ontario. LG stands for Lucky Gold Star. Lucky Gold Star got its start in the HCI drive in the 1970s. Hyundai also emerges from this both as a shipbuilder and a metals company, but also then finally, as we know it today, as an automotive company, also from the same period of time. So Korea responded to a geopolitical shock by bolstering its industrial strategy by making strong investments in the upstream industrial base. And some of the most exciting literature coming out of the empirical studies of industrial strategy today suggests that this strategy actually of investing in the upstream is highly efficient an economic perspective, because basically what you're doing is you subsidize a small number of sectors, and then those subsidies are able to flow through the economy downstream to all of the other sectors that use those inputs. So in the case of Canada, if we think about bolstering clean power and critical minerals and steel and
Mhm.
aluminum on a really focused innovation forward steel and aluminum strategy, but we also make investments in trade infrastructure and trade corridors, which are again, one of the most exciting parts of what this government is currently putting on the table, then we're making investments in every single industry that we want to compete in. All of our downstream industries will benefit from subsidizing those upstream industrial-based sectors, because those sectors will then feed and support all of the other sectors. So these investments in the upstream become really critical, and they provide us with a way of doing all of the things that we're trying to do at the same time right now, at the same time, right? We're trying to
Mhm.
rebuild sovereignty in a defense state sense and in an economic sense. We're trying to diversify trade. We're trying to produce products that the world needs, like critical minerals and other things. And we're trying to basically position ourselves in these global future value chains. And we can do all three of these things at the same time if we really focus on the upstream.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a great point on the kind of explaining that upstream industrial base. And um, I want to kind of go to one of the questions in the from the audience, just because it's related to this new approach. Basically, the question is, there's a bit of a structural bias within the sort of civil service that sort of block effective industrial strategy. I'm kind of sort of summarizing
Right.
here, but one is sectoral capture, right? So you have industry, auto, aerospace, defense that kind of lobby for specific sectors without really that cross-industry cost benefit
Yep.
that you mentioned. And then there's
Yep.
also a little bit of like what the question was framed as a neoliberal kind of hangover, which is uh, the idea of not picking sectors, they're all important, leading to the sort of scattered project by project support instead of that strategic value chain. Like, how do you kind of overcome some of these biases? So I think that's really it's the approach, but also the governance side of things.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. And thank you, Nadeem, for the question, and good to see you on here. I think that the answer, I mean, this is a fundamental problem inherent to Westminster systems. I mean, the UK has basically the same problem. Australia has the same problem, which is that if you have very strong departments, if you have very strong ministries, it's very difficult to get the kind of collaboration across those divisions that you need to in order to execute on an industrial strategy. Um, in Korea, they do this through an extremely strong industrial strategy ministry. Um, in China, there's 3 or 4 ministries that are all kind of like industrial strategy ministries that end up being quite strong, and they compete with each other for the pen, basically, on different parts of the industrial strategy. But at the same time, you have a very strong central committee that is really exerting its own opinions on these matters in a robust, ongoing way. The problem in the Canadian governance system is that there's very little expertise in the center. So whether it's PMO from a political angle or PCO from a management perspective, there tends to be very little long-term expertise actually occupying either of those sources. So the deep expertise is in the sectors, which becomes the point at which the firms lobby. The firms lobby into the departments. And that creates a disjuncture between where political decision making is made and where expertise lies. And I think that the only way out of this is to create some central body where there truly is expertise. And I think that that's difficult to do within the current Canadian system, but structurally that is the answer, right? Now, you could imagine different ways this going. You could imagine the PCO, the Privy Clerk's office, becoming more robust in terms of its role rather than merely being a facilitator or a manager of different things that are going on, but rather to start taking opinions. You can imagine the PMO having expertise off of it, whether that's through an advisory council to the PMO or something like that. Or you could imagine independent intermediaries being brought in to exchange with the departments through like a task force or something like that, that maybe had access to the PMO. These kinds of options are ways of creating a central body where you can have that cross-sectoral conversation in a robust way. Because I do think that Nadim's question puts his finger on the heart of the issue, right? Which is that we're not having that cross-sectoral conversation in as robust a fashion as we need to. So that's one, is that there does need to be some place, some central place, some strong central place where you're making, where you're engaging in a collaborative process of learning. But I also think that Nadim's question raises deeper issues too about how we mobilize expertise within a government that, after 30 years of neoliberalism, um, does not like have the strategic capacity in order to really do the kind of deep analysis that we need in order to have a serious conversation about industrial strategy nationally. So I think we're moving in that direction. I see a lot of good work happening in the departments, and I think that I see a lot in the public announcements of the ministers and of the prime minister that shows that the sophistication in the thinking and the analysis is advancing very quickly. And we, of course, at the Transition Accelerator are trying to make as much public conversation about standards. So, for example, we published a project prioritization framework that we feel provides a way for us to have a rigorous discussion about the value of national projects. Now, we did that before the current insanity around national projects. Um, uh, but that's us trying to bring rigor to this external evaluation problem that I think is endemic to industrial strategy. And I think that the problem is that most of the measures that we would want to use to evaluate our sectors are ones that don't really fit neatly into the box of neoclassical economics, which tends to dominate the policy discussion in all countries, not just in Canada, right? So we need things like very clear benchmarks and targets that are quantitatively stated and that are publicly stated so that we can have a kind of robust public debate about that through our democracy about whether or not the bets that we're making are the right ones. But for example, I mean, we basically had committed $40 billion on 3 battery factories without any public discussion about what the metric or the benchmark of that success was and how we would know whether or not that investment paid off. And that to me is more troubling than anything else. That it's not even clear how we would have a democratic discussion about whether or not that was a good public investment or not. Because
Right.
the level of expertise, both coming out of the government, but also amongst ourselves, I put myself first on the list of people who should be accountable for this as a supposed expert in the space. We just need to be more robust and rigorous in the way that we're having this conversation. And the MPO discussion, the major projects conversation now, raises
Yeah.
all these questions again. How are we going to know that these projects were good projects? How are we going to know that these projects are the ones that are truly of national significance and should be of national significance? And I think the cynical answer is, well, the PMO is going to do politics, so we should just let them do politics, right? And of course, that's going to happen. There are going to be some projects that experts and people in the departments could look at together and say, those were politically chosen projects, right? So let's just take for granted that that's going to happen. Well, then the real benchmark becomes how many of the best projects actually get done and get accelerated? And can we, as a community that brings evidence and expertise to bear on the conversation, can we make sure that more of those get done than would otherwise get done in the
Yeah.
absence of a robust discussion about standards and evaluations?
The Venn diagram between good projects and also politically beneficial projects.
Right,
So
exactly.
I think
Yeah.
that's what we're going after. To get to that, I think the second part of the conversation that I wanted to kind of move us into is the governance implementation. I think we kind of was a really nice segue with Nadim's question. I'm going to try to combine two questions really in one, which is really on the provinces and the role of industrial policy more regionally. So one of the question is like, how do you actually manage this in a sort of a federal system where you have provinces and that may want different things and different mines, and I want the mine and I want the plant here. And then I guess one of the questions that's, maybe you can sort of tack that on is, what is the sort of role of place-based industrial strategy in Canada, given that, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is huge, and I think that this is really important. And again, this has been a big part of the industrial strategy conversation since Minister Wilkinson's energy and resource tables, which again, I think the political vision there was absolutely correct, which is that you can't do a robust green industrial strategy or clean industrial strategy without the robust participation of the provinces in an ongoing process.
Yeah.
And so I think that has produced, like that exercise has produced a lot of learning that now we can harvest for the current moment that we are in, right? I mean, the first thing is that the provinces themselves need to have their own strategies. And right now, I think that that's a difficult ask because, again, the ecosystem of expertise and evidence and the standards by which we're going to evaluate industrial strategies, we're just starting to get our hands on that, right? So I think one thing has become a pretty clear standard, which is Canadian value added. And that's something that we've done a lot of work on over the last 5 years. And I feel like now it's finally part of the conversation. And even folks in the provinces understand that that's a critical goal, right? That we want to maximize value added within the border rather than exporting raw materials. Um, so that's a standard that we need to have. But then global competitiveness standards, export standards, these things also need to be evaluated at the provincial level so that provinces really understand how they would articulate their own individual industrial strategies, both in a national and in an international perspective. Because then when the federal government is having conversations with the provinces, we're already starting that conversation at a high level. So again, if we're already in a robust conversation about what the best projects are, and we have the ability to evaluate those projects in an open and transparent way, then we're already starting from a position point where we're not just having provinces lobby for their politically favored projects, but we're having a discussion on the basis of evidence and standards for what's actually going to deliver long-term economic value for the country, right? And that's a
Yeah,
critical kind of starting point for a federal industrial policy, because otherwise we're just extending the log rolling and the capture problem from being a firm specific problem to being a regional specific problem, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
then the federal government is basically being lobbied both by corporate interests and by regional interests at the same time. And then the national interest gets lost, right? Um,
So you got to say no, basically, right? And I think one of the questions is how do you say no? What kind to yeah, like essentially that was what like to
yeah,
really look at the questions in terms of the framing. It's like how do we set up governments to say no to proposals that don't fit this national integrated strategy? What are the actual mechanisms to maintain the
yeah.
focus, right?
I mean, governments can tie their own hands. They just don't like to do that, right? So one favored tool of experts
Um,
is to delegate, right? So in California, a lot of foreign policy, a lot of climate policy and industrial strategy is delegated to CARB, the California Air Resources Board, which is an independent, really expert and very technocratic entity. And that insulates the decisions that are made for California's climate policy, but that has a cost, right? That has a political cost too. Well, that means you can't manipulate that policy easily for politics, or it's just at least more complicated to manipulate that policy for politics. Um, so governments could tie their hands, but they're not inclined to do that because they do want to be able to use things like the Strategic Innovation Fund and other things for their own political purposes. So I think being able to say no does come from having high internal standards. And again, it comes from having a common, robust set of metrics about what those standards are going to be within the departments that then can arrange an interdepartmental conversation within the government. And then you can use that same set of standards to have a conversation with the
Yeah,
provinces about what projects are we going to do. And right now we evaluate things just on like how big is the investment, how many jobs are there, and now we're starting to add value add as a key criteria there. But like export potential through a rigorous analysis of both, are we in an area where exports are already growing fast? And are we in an area where imports for the rest of the world, especially the rest of the world outside the United States, are growing fast? So we can add that trade diversification index if you want as a
mm,
critical metric that we're going to use to evaluate an industrial strategy. And then there are deeper things like, how many homegrown firms are we scaling? This is a really important indicator because those firms scaling usually correlates nicely with productivity and usually also correlates nicely with domestic R&D spend, which correlates nicely with innovation potential. So finding those kinds of metrics, like are we scaling homegrown firms, as being another kind of critical metric that we're using to evaluate an industrial strategy. And making sure that the provinces are actually thinking about putting projects on the table that actually meet all of these criteria, right? And we can also add conservation criteria, which I think is really important. One of the most interesting phrases in the Liberal platform for Mark Carney's government is that we're going to do holistic ecosystem assessment and use that to integrate with our climate competitiveness strategy. And I think that's so important. I think having conservation as being a way to say no on some of these major projects that might be
yeah,
politically viable, but actually are going to be deeply environmentally destructive. That's another way to say no. But I just say it's easier to say no if you're publicly articulating your standards than if you're not.
yeah. Bentley, on that trade diversification component, I want to kind of come back to that in a bit. But just before we go there, you had mentioned the Major Projects Office. There's also, one of the key agencies that the
Yeah.
government has announced is Build Canada Homes. And I think there's an opportunity there to really, embed an industrial policy and strategy in both of these things. Um, Curious about your thoughts on that one. I mean, that was one of the questions that
Yeah.
tangentially came in, but that's reframing kind of two in one here.
Yeah, so I think these are great. So Build Canada Homes, especially, I think is a really exciting opportunity.
Yeah,
I think one of the things that we put in the Mass Timber Roadmap that Derek and I did with FPAC and the Forest Products Association of Canada and the Canada Wood Council, we collaborated on the Mass Timber Roadmap. And one of our key recommendations was the government should use procurement in order to scale mass timber and modular and prefab housing. And this is something that the Europeans were doing quite well when we were studying the mass timber roadmap in 2023, 2024. And it was just an obvious place where we could create win-wins here, right? We can scale an industry and drive down the cost of housing. This is a really clear place where mass timber adding value to natural resources is an easy play to do. So I think Build Canada Homes could be a really excellent piece of that overall picture. But what that means is that Build Canada Homes becomes a strategic agent within the industrial strategy, right? And often we're creating programs without making those programs strategic agents within the industrial strategy. So one of the things I love about the Clean Growth Fund is that we've created something that's independent, nominally independent from the political to and fro, right? Because it's located within the PSP,
yeah.
and therefore is insulated from direct PMO influence, let's say. Um, Therefore, political influence, at least directly, right? And it can make technocratic, strong decisions from that insulated environment. That's great. We have a real strong strategic actor in the Canada Growth Fund, but it can't solve all of our problems. We need other strategic actors like Build Canada Homes to step into a different niche and say, okay, we're going to be the strategic actor. We're going to be where the best line department expertise and the best external expertise come together to help us create strong investments that scale our industrial strategy, right? But again, that's dependent on us having a very clear national vision that everybody knows about from the industrial strategy standpoint. And I do think the Carney government is moving in that direction, right? Um, and having an open toolkit, which I'm also very excited to say that the Build Canada Homes, all of the announcements have made it clear they're going to have a really full and open toolkit to be able to do real strategic work, which is fantastic. And the Canada Growth Fund was an excellent precedent on this front, right? This is a strategic agent with a full toolkit. MPO is an open question as to whether or not it can be or should be a strategic actor with the same level of autonomy and interest as, say, Build Canada Homes and the Canada Growth Fund, right? I think it's necessarily more political because of the alignment of the Carney government's vision for the country and what the Major Projects Office is. But at the same time, I think it can be a place where strategy gets created, right? And where they make the move from being just a clearinghouse or a stamping organization to something that does kind of active project development on behalf of the
Mm,
government that brings projects that, you can think about that first tranche of projects, the A list and the B list, as being A list, these projects are mostly done, and B list, they sound like they're too far away to actually be real projects, right? And there's a lot of other projects that I would put closer towards not yet shovel ready, but would be really excellent to do. And if the MPO cannot just accelerate approvals, but actually can play the role in making sure that all of the tools of the government from a policy side, whether that's supply side and demand side policies, are getting aligned, that specific financing and contracts that are needed to unlock specific projects are implemented for those, then it becomes a kind of strategic actor in this full sense. And I want to come back to Nadim's question actually one more time, because I think I answered it wrong. I think I answered it wrong. It's not that you need one central place to do industrial strategy in the government. I actually think for a pluralistic, messy, regional, federalist place like Canada, having one center would be wrong. What we need are a bunch of these centers, right?
mhm.
And therefore, we can see the CGF as being, well, we need 8 different entities that are kind of like that populate the different space. We need more of them to operate across sectors the way that CGF does, and the MPO could operate across sectors. And then we need more strategic entities like BCH that operate within a sector. And then we've got an ecosystem going because we've got a bunch of places where we're locating strategic expertise. And now we can have debates. Now we can have debates in front of the PMO, in front of cabinet about the best way forward for this particular sector because we've got a bunch of different things with a different vision of what industrial strategy would be in this sector. So I actually think that my considered answer to Nadim's question is that structurally, we need a plurality of strategic centers, and BCH and MPO can do that. They can contribute to this broader ecosystem of industrial strategy insight that the country is going to need in order to have high standards and good bets.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Bentley. There's a lot of questions, good questions coming in, so I'm going to keep us moving here, and I want to move to the policy side, right? So we talked about the governance implementation. So really good points on the major projects office. I think I would kind of summarize what you just said is like how does MPO actually create a pipeline of projects over the long
Yeah,
term, and those projects align with our overall industrial strategy vision for the different sectors.
yeah.
One of the question was like, isn't it necessarily just picking winners and losers? And I think this is your answer. I think kind of emphasizes that that's not necessarily what needs to happen here. It needs to be much more strategic than just that, and link to a broader value chain assessment and broader cost benefit assessment, as you kind of said, with an industrial base,
Yeah.
upstream industrial base kind of thinking. But I want to move us to the policy side. A lot of question here in terms of the policy tools. Um, Maybe we can kind of talk a little bit broadly about demand side versus supply side tools, and then maybe you can give us an example for let's say critical minerals, right? So to kind of make it a bit more concrete for folks.
Yeah. So many of the policies that we have on the books in critical minerals are what I would call supply side subsidies. So on the supply side, a supply side policy basically increases our ability to produce something or to make it cheaper, right? So an R&D grant is a supply side policy. It creates the innovation and the capacity that we need to produce something or potentially make it cheaper in the case of an innovation that radically changes the process or something like that. And most subsidies are just supply side inputs. They basically reduce costs. So you could think about it that way, right? They're basically providing the company with some offset to their costs or some additional revenue for engaging in a certain kind of activity, which is to say to supply a certain kind of product, right? What we don't have enough of in the Canadian policy context are demand side tools, which are ones that ensure that those products are actually being pulled into the market and achieving scale within those markets, right? And in the case of critical minerals, we have a very specific demand side problem, which is that China dominates global critical minerals markets, and in many ways can basically is having a strong effect on the prices in each of those markets. So there was a famous case in minerals markets last year of basically China running a strong arbitrage where it was basically working to structurally depress prices. And there are also instances where China just is bringing a lot of feed online. So in the case of nickel, that's creating structurally low prices for nickel. And a lot of that is coming out of Indonesia, and most of that Indonesian nickel is owned by Chinese firms. So we're structurally depressing nickel prices, and this is having a deterrent effect on investment in critical minerals in the West, which would de-risk us from China. So just there's a market failure here. We would like to be de-risked from China, but ultimately we can't get investment in China because prices are too low. The way to
Yeah,
solve this is with a demand side tool. You can just regulate demand side tools. You can just say to everybody, you have to buy Canadian nickel in order to have a steel plant in this country. You could do that, right? You could say it to the automakers. You could say all cars made in Canada have to have Canadian steel, right? These things would create demand, right? They would secure a market for Canadian nickel. But they wouldn't necessarily be globally competitive, right? They might make the producers of these products lazy in the long run because they don't have any competition. And that might increase costs in the long run. And that was basically a way of taxing consumers and firms. And then you're worse off because you've done that, right? So in some cases, a robust stick like that on the demand side might be necessary. Procurement is another critical demand side policy. So we could, through the Department of National Defense, just procure and stockpile a whole bunch of critical minerals. The problem is Where are we going to put it? Do we know what we're going to use it for? Is it going to be refined? Not all critical minerals can be in an easily stockpilable form until they're fully refined, which is making decisions about how the downstream should be located. This stuff gets really complicated really quick with stockpiling. And even in the biggest stockpiling measures, you're just dealing at the margins of these very large markets, right?
Yeah.
In smaller things like scandium, stockpile, and tungsten, maybe like, stockpiling could play a more critical role. But in big things like nickel and copper, which is where we really think the action is both for our economy and for geopolitics as a whole, it's going to be difficult to do that meaningfully through just procurement and stockpiling and things like that. Instead, you could use market-based mechanisms on the demand side. And we've done a whole bunch of work on using contract for difference or price mechanisms on the demand side in critical minerals, which is a way of guaranteeing a price, right? And indexing that price so that the firm knows it's going to get at least $9,000 a ton for copper. And in a true contract for difference, if the price goes below 9,000, then the government covers the gap. We'll say the global price is 8,500 a ton and it stays that way. The government would have to subsidize $500 a ton to the firm.
Yeah.
But if copper prices rise, and we think that copper prices are going to structurally rise over the next decade, and it goes above 9,000, well, then the government would capture the upside. So at $9,500 a ton, the government still pays, ensures that the firm gets 9,000, but the government captures everything above this strike price. This is a market-based mechanism in the sense that it doesn't induce additional cost to the firm, to the public. It basically guarantees a nice low price if you set that strike price appropriately. And so in that sense, it's market-based, but it allows the government to recoup some benefit from taking on risk with the firms. And so it's a policy tool that I like because it solves for multiple things at the same time. It provides demand side certainty, it gives us geopolitical advantages, it keeps the firms competitive in global markets, and it allows the public to recoup some of the money that it might otherwise get. So that's supply and demand side in the critical minerals space. But you have to think at this level of detail about how we're calibrating all of the policy inputs in every single sector, right? And one of the things I have really appreciated about the Prime Minister's recent comments about the automotive sector and the EV availability standard, or more popularly known as the ZEV mandate, the zero emissions vehicles mandate, is that we're going to look at all of the tools that are impacting mobility decarbonization in this country, and we're going to take a strategic look at how all of them are working together to assess whether or not they're calibrated to create a competitive,
Mhm.
globally fit, and globally innovative industry. And that's exactly the right question to be asking.
Yeah, that's a great point, Bentley. I want to just, can you give us that example from the US on the contracts for difference? I think it just makes it a bit more real and less kind of hypothetical.
Yeah, so recently the Department of Defense did what I would call a contract for difference, but they just referred to it in their public statement as a price mechanism, as a price support, price floor, with MP Materials. So MP Materials is a rare earth miner and now and refiner, but also is now going to move into the magnet space.
Mhm.
And the DoD basically gave a price floor, and they said you're going to get $110 a kilogram for rare earth oxide. That's a guaranteed price that we will basically cover any gap below that for the market price. But if the price ever goes above that, the government's going to capture 30% of the upside. So they only took a 30% share of the upside in a pure contract for difference. As I said, the government captures all of the upside. But this is a negotiating point between the firm and the government when these things can be negotiated up and down. But the DoD also took an equity stake in MP Materials, so basically bought 15% of the company, and therefore will generate recoup some of its investment through dividends through the company ownership structure. And then finally, DoD signed an offtake for magnets. So they basically said we are going to buy a whole bunch of the magnets that you're going to produce with this rare earths at a guaranteed price, right? So this is a way of completely de-risking the business model for MP Materials. I think there's some problems with the way the deal was structured. I think that 30% is too low, especially when you consider that 110 is way above the current price of rare earths, which is 60. And admittedly, 60 is a little low, like rare earth prices are down right now. But even if you take the 5-year average, 110 is way above the 5-year average. And I also think that the offtake is very strong, and so it's guaranteeing a very high price for the offtake in those. But we actually don't know MP Materials' ability to make magnets, and so there's a lot of risk being taken on there by the
Yeah.
government to guarantee that investment. And instead, what you would like is an aggressive strike price, like one that's really tight to the 5-year average. And then at that point, you could imagine the government taking a lower share because the firm is taking on some risk because the strike price is so aggressive. But if the strike price is high, then the government should recoup 100%, right? And
Yeah.
if the strike price is low, then the government should recoup maybe nothing because the firm is still taking on lots of risk. But you can imagine this is the negotiating space in which a firm and the government will be
Yeah.
interacting over.
So the deal structure is good, but like maybe the numbers wouldn't necessarily be ideal for, given everything
Yeah,
you mentioned, basically.
it,
That's
it
great.
provides a really
Yeah.
powerful template, but also important lessons learned for how we calibrate these deals.
Yeah. Yeah. So we got about 12 minutes left here. We've been kind of running through lots of questions. I want to kind of bring us back a little bit on we're talking about industrial policy more broadly, but then specifically when we're looking at um, some of the tools you mentioned, you can sort of do the buy Canadian part, right? Then there's conversations around the defense industrial strategy portion of the equation. We're also trying to do trade diversification at the same time. How do those two things work together or against each other when you're trying to do local content requirements and you're also trying to diversify trade and build new trade relationships with international partners, right? How do you balance those two things, which can kind of seem contradictory in a way in terms of relationships with new trade partners?
Yeah, I mean, this is the hardest thing to do, but the good news is that when industrial strategy is done well, then firms are able to be supported to find their niche in what we call collaborative global value chains. My friend
Mm.
Jonas Nam wrote this book
Yeah, yeah,
called Collaborative Advantage. Um, and that image that he gives us is of countries playing into their competitive niches within global value chains. And those competitive niches are set by the expertise that they have, but also the infrastructure and the resources and things like that. And ideally, we are able to both cooperate and compete at the same time, if that makes sense, right? That countries are able to robustly compete in some sectors, while at the same time having their firms occupy strategic niches in each other's value chains, right? So,
yeah,
um, one of the critical exchanges between us and Korea has been in the midstream of the battery space. Korea has big downstream battery champions. We've got some innovative ideas in the midstream. We have critical minerals in the upstream. I already made the case they have a strong chemicals industry, which means that they can refine things just fine. They can do cathode active material on their own just fine. But there's a way for us to have our firms be world leaders and their firms be world leaders, but nonetheless create collaborative supply chains and to deepen those relationships while diversifying trade is it's possible at least theoretically, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
The
yeah,
problem is that it's very hard and slow work to build these kinds of relationships, right? And the way that industrial strategy tends to accelerate the development of them is by creating a space for coordination. So we often again think of markets as having perfect information, which is to say a firm knows everything about every other firm that it could compete with or cooperate with in a value chain. But that is not true, of course. Firms are just filled with people who either have a personal relationship in a network or they don't. And so the work of the government of taking firms on trade trips, of
yeah,
liaising, of trade commissioners being really good at their job, all of that is just the hard everyday work that is necessary in order to build those kinds of value chains and find those strategic niches, right? And we can do a better job of that by knowing where to hunt, let's say, right? So a trade
yeah,
diversification strategy can tell us where our exports at a very granular level are growing fast and where their imports at a very granular level are growing fast. And we can do that matchmaking that enables us to look in the right places. But at the end of the day, this happens at the speed of human relationships. And one of the critical roles of the government in industrial strategy is to accelerate the pace of human relationships.
yeah. That's a really good point, Bentley. And I think ultimately, like you, even in the absence of this kind of buy Canadian or local content, like you still, all of this is still applicable, right? It just makes it a bit more. It just adds another layer or another kind of limiting factor, which is now you're trying to basically not, piss off your trading partners by excluding them
Right.
from coming in, right? So,
Or
yeah,
making sure that their workers don't have visas when they're trying to teach you how to make batteries.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Okay, well, that's great. There's a lot of cool questions. One of the questions is just to kind of bring us to closer to the end here in terms of the reality check. Um, Electoral kind of politics, 4-year cycles. We saw what happened in the U.S. You're living it in a very concrete way in terms of like IRA, Biden's out, Trump comes in. How do you insulate industrial strategy from it, or can you even from the sort of political cycles and the what happens with those kind of political wins?
Yeah, I mean, there is no way to do this. Like I said at the beginning in the Korea case, right? I mean, the best case scenario is that you use it, right? You never let a crisis go to waste, that you take advantage
Yeah,
of the political difficulties and you use them to make stronger investments in your country. And again, that's what the vision that the current government has is the right vision for exactly that reason. Um, so I don't think you can insulate it, and I don't think you would want to. I think these things are really hard, right? Like motivating climate policy is hard. This is an energy system that was built through war and empire. The British Empire built a coal-based system. The United States built an oil-based system through
yeah,
war and empire. We are not going to change that energy system without a world historical set of events that is of equal stature, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean war and empire, but it means something awfully close to war and empire, right? And a true geostrategic challenge between the United States and China, in which countries like Canada have to find their way because they no longer have the relationship with their superpower patron that they thought that they did. This is all to the good, actually, right? I
yeah,
would much rather live in a world where we're highly motivated to do interesting things on the energy transition than live in the neoliberal doldrums where we were 20 years ago, right? This was always the best case scenario, is that it was going to feel super difficult and edgy and stressful. And I think we're lucky that we're able to have in the Canadian context, not lucky in the American context. Um, to be able to have a robust democratic conversation about what that response is. And I think that we're fortunate to have a leader in Mr. Carney who gets these fundamental parameters in a truly intimate and deep way.
so if we do this right, in 20 years we'll be thanking Trump for pushing us to do
100%.
take action, right?
There's no doubt in my mind. Like if we
Yeah,
literally pull together and do this seriously, we
yeah,
will look back on that moment and think positively about it. I mean, I was teaching the European Battery Alliance in class on Tuesday, and the European Battery Alliance happened in 2018. And
yeah.
the money quote in the original Financial Times article that got me to sit up straight and get obsessed with industrial strategy is Bruno Le Maire, the French Foreign Ministry, saying that European battery capacity is a matter of sovereignty. And he meant that at its core, right? That we do not have an independent status in this world if we as Europe do not control the battery value chain, because without
Mhm.
that, we don't make steel, we don't process nickel, we don't have an automotive industry, we don't have anything. We're not an independent economic center anymore. And we can't fight a war. So we got to get serious about this. Now, why did Europe do that in 2018? I mean, the answer is Trump. Trump threatened abandonment of Europe in his first term. And that spawned the European Battery Alliance. The European Battery Alliance helped the US wake up and do the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act helped us wake up and do Made in Canada 2023. And now Trump is making us take another leap forward in our industrial strategy. And I think actually that's for the better in the long run.
Yeah. Bentley, there's people asking about this book. You mentioned it was How Ottawa Decides by Richard French, right? So just
Yeah, it's a
it's in the
fantastic
chat.
title. Yeah, like I said, all the credit goes to David Wolf. Yeah.
Excellent. Um, so I think one of the things that you mentioned, and I want to kind of come back to a little bit on innovation. you know, Homegrown companies. We have a lot of really innovative companies and firms in Canada. How do we make sure? Well, one, which sectors do you think they're going to come from? Like maybe you can give just a high level. Are they consistent with the sectors identified in the white paper? And two, how do you make sure like what is the recipe for homegrown for growing homegrown companies that are going to be successful globally in scale? So
Yeah.
yeah, we don't have a lot of time for this, but I want to kind of end on a positive note since the war and doom and gloom was a little.
No, this is exactly what I'm saying, is that
Yeah,
war
yeah.
is good. No, I'm not saying no. Um, just that we can't be afraid of it. That's all.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, Sahir Khan, who is one of the most astute observers of Canadian politics, if you guys aren't following him on LinkedIn, you should do that. He's at the University of Ottawa Institute for Governance, and he said something along the lines of, or his Institute for Fiscal Studies, sorry. He said something along the lines of like, it's time to pay the cost of sovereignty, right? And I just thought that that way of phrasing it is that's exactly the
Mm,
right framing. We have to pay the
yeah,
cost of sovereignty. And the cost of sovereignty can only come from a coherent industrial strategy. Like we literally we cannot figure out how to pay the cost in a way that actually enhances our national standing in
yeah,
a difficult geopolitical world unless we pay the cost. So thank God we are now ready to pay the cost is basically my perspective.
yeah.
Um, On to your actual question though. I mean, I think that it is about demand side. Sorry, give it to me
Well,
again.
the sectors like the homegrown companies, which sectors
Oh,
will they
yeah,
come
right.
from,
Scaling,
and how
scaling.
do we scale? How do we scale them? Just generally, like, why did we lose some of those winners, basically?
Yeah, I mean, this is like if I had an answer to this, I mean, I'd get whatever the Canadian wonk version of the Nobel Prize is. I mean, this is the number one question in industrial strategy, and I don't think anybody has an answer that is precise
Yeah,
that we can really deliver on.
I mean, ultimately,
Um,
there's always going to be temptations, right? There's always going to be like price that a firm comes in and is like, yeah, I'm going to sell. But I mean, outside of that, there are firms that are gonna have they're forced to do stuff outside of that kind of exit strategy.
yeah.
They're forced to sell or they're forced to seek funding elsewhere, which then dilutes the Canadian ownership.
Yeah. And the Prime Minister, in his comments at the Council of Foreign Relations in New York this week, which I recommend, especially if you're interested in this like industrial strategy,
Mm,
geopolitics cross, because it gives you a sense of what his thinking on that is like. Somebody asked him this question kind of pointedly, like, don't you think we should have a better VC culture in Canada? And he's like, actually, I
mm.
don't think that would help. Um, and he didn't elaborate,
Yeah,
but I'll take the danger of elaborating, right? So, and this is
yeah.
something that I learned from Travis Southern, who is our industrial strategy lead in the Future Economy Group at TA, who is a student of David's. And Travis always argues that that effectively. Um, the problem is that a lot of these companies have VC money, and so they need to exit. And that means that they need to sell. And that
Exactly.
encourages them to go where capital markets are deep. So actually having VC money makes you more likely to be sold to the United States because you're basically being pushed to exit.
Yeah,
And so, I mean, I think that the problems, I really don't want to sound fuzzy about this, but I do think that the problems in scaling have more to do with culture and with the kind of naturally conservative way that we have approached in like policy and industrial policy specifically, both in the public sector and in the private sector, right? Not wanting to pick winners and trusting other people's judgment more than our own, I think is kind of the fundamental problem here. Because investors, like institutional investors, I mean like Power Corp and PSP and Case de Poix and other kind of large companies and firms that do make strategic investments in the Canadian economy, they need to be educated about what our strategic advantages actually are and where our competitive advantages truly do lie, so that they can make strategic investments in Canadian firms in a way that's not VC and that's not being pushing them towards exit, right? Part of the problem is we don't have enough power corps. We don't have enough sources of Canadian capital taking a strong interest in helping and supporting the ecosystem, right?
yeah.
So we need to do some work just to keep more capital at home. And I assume that Prime
Mhm.
Minister Carney is working strong on the financial plumbing for that because that's his bailiwick and not mine.
Yeah,
But that's a critical piece of this, right? How do we keep more Canadian dollars inside Canada without driving away international investment? Like finding a sweet spot there is going to be really critical to us, bolstering our sovereignty. But also, I think that uh, that will help us scale homegrown firms. But also, we need to have this valley of death really have some confidence in being able to support firms through that valley of death in the Canadian economy. And more of these strategic actors, like the Canada Growth Fund, like potentially what what BCH could be in the housing space, would give us access to the expertise kind of from within the government family to be able to have confidence in which firms we should save from death in that valley, right?
Yeah.
Because I do
Yeah.
think that many of the firms that have died are ones that could have been competitive, and many of the firms that get purchased by foreign folks could have been propped up by the government and would have preferred to stay independent, right? And so this is what I mean by the kind of naturally conservative culture of the country has kind of made us shy away from backing our own actors in
Mhm,
this
mhm.
space, right? And so I think first thing is to change our attitude, and I think the prime minister has done that. I think Trump has helped a lot to do that. And I think the second thing is, again, for all of us who are on this call to like participate as actively as you can in this ecosystem that I'm envisioning, where we're all arguing with each other about the quality of the industrial strategy bets that are being made, instead of just receiving them passively and then wondering about it. Like, let's go ahead and
Mhm.
evaluate and let's participate in that. And let's support the government in having more intelligence in the way that they can approach these questions.
Yeah, and I would also add maybe like the local content or the demand side policies, like for example, like the Honda deal, where there was a requirement to get the
Yeah.
tax credits, you have to have Canadian content, like that can help scale some
Yep.
companies that can, be the providers of that content
Yes.
into. So how do you leverage foreign direct
Yes.
investment as a way to actually prop up your own homegrown companies?
Totally. And what we need is like Sean Silkoff or Adam Radwanski or Gabe Friedman to figure out who came up with this idea because it's brilliant. It's like, I think the EV supply chain credit that you're talking about,
I
where you
thought
could
you
only
did.
get access to the, no, I wish that like I think every policy analyst looks at that policy and
Yeah,
sees how it ties together multiple
yeah,
objectives
yeah,
and that is inspiration, right?
yeah.
Um,
And
uh,
it did it in a very good way too, because it didn't
yes,
actually say it has to be Canadian. It said it has to be somebody that
yes,
got this other tax credit, but you can't really
yeah,
get this other tax credit unless you're manufacturing in Canada.
yes.
So indirectly,
So
it says, yeah,
we need a
yeah,
glossy
yeah,
profile of these people so that people understand that they're this is like wonk
yeah,
dreams, right? That
yeah,
wonks would
yeah,
get glossy profiles in our national
yeah.
newspaper.
On that note, we're like basically we've been chatting for an hour. We've covered a lot of questions. I really want to thank all the participants. Basically we had a really good retention till the end of the hour, even though we're kind of talking about wonky stuff as you putting it, Bentley. But anything you want to leave the audience with here, and we appreciate everybody's questions. We're kind of testing this format out, but we'll probably do it again
Yeah.
soon.
No, I like this, and I just want to make a commitment to the participants that we'll grab a bunch of these questions out of the Q&A
Yeah,
if we can, in fact, logistically do that.
we can
And
do that. Yeah.
yeah, like literally, let's just make a TA. We'll make a TA LinkedIn post, and we'll post the questions as comments, and then I'll come in and answer as many of them as I can. And I invite everybody here to find that and
Yeah.
participate in that conversation. Because to me, that's my main message for today: is that we all need to participate in Canadian industrial strategy for it to be better.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Bentley, and thanks everyone for joining.